So Nintendo's back at it again. I saw this pop up and I thought I would put out a tweet for it and get a bunch of replies, so I thought we'd go over that. But I'm going to read you what Nintendo is doing right now, and it's kind of interesting to think about because Nintendo's a very creative company, and they're one that we have a hard time really guessing what's next for them. I think Labo now has really proven that even if we think we know what Nintendo's about to do, they do something completely different at times, and it really keeps us guessing. And it is good to see a company kind of keeping that creative vision alive, because it does feel kind of status quo at times. And again, Nintendo just out of left field sometimes, where people are building things with cardboard and doing some really cool stuff. Who would have thought that would be a thing, 2 years ago or so? And here we are now. So I'm actually going to talk to you a bit about what's happening here with Nintendo, because they are talking a little bit about next generation, and what some of your replies are. We can kind of go over a few things and what I think they might be able to do, because again, it's just us guessing at this point. So let me know what you think they could do down below after we go through this video and see some of the replies on the tweet. And also make sure you follow me on Twitter, because I'll be doing this more and more going forward, where I can check out your replies on the channel through Twitter, and we'll have some fun. Also make sure you like the video if you enjoy it, and subscribe, because I got some cool stuff planned for this weekend. So, what is happening here? Well, Nintendo apparently is striving to create a controller that can be used with ease and that will become the standard for the next generation. That's right, we're talking next gen stuff here. Now, this was during their annual shareholders meeting. We've talked about that before. 79th one, I believe now. And this is something that people have honed in on, because Miyamoto himself said this. And it gets you kind of thinking, gets the creative juices flowing a bit here. This is what he had to say. Nintendo was the first to create the style of playing video games with a plus-shaped directional pad and additional buttons, which has now become the industry standard. He's referring to the NES when that showed up. It was a very weird thing to see that, because before then, the controllers were all over the place. We were using full-on, like, phone number pads with, like, overlays that you would slide in. Nintendo, this weird company from Japan, is how a lot of people in the US viewed it, show up with what was really sold as a toy with the original Nintendo, had what we know now as a D-pad, and on the right were two buttons. And it took off well, and we still use that now if you think about it. On the left, usually we have our movement sticks or D-pad, and then on the right we have our action or face buttons. So it's something that they really brought out then, and now it's like super popular and everyone sticks with that. It was also Nintendo that changed the original plus-shaped directional pad, which operated digitally in 8 directions, into the first analog input device that moves freely in all directions for the Nintendo 64. This too is now common. We are proud to have created a variety of user interfaces that have now become industry standards. So the thing about the analog stick, it's a bit different. Of course, when it showed up on the 64, because it was being used in 3D space, it was this really, really big deal. But there were things that had technically analog sticks or joysticks before that. It's just Nintendo managed to popularize it and also pair it with 3D visuals that really took it to the next level, because before that we were all using 2D planes and everything. For them to take the analog stick, make it so you mostly just use it with a thumb, and obviously be able to rotate in the directions and everything as they're saying, and then pair it with something like Mario 64, it was like mind-blowing at the time. So they managed to popularize that, and again, we're using analog sticks now to this day. I think Sony did a good job showing up with a dual analog stick set that, again, we've then taken that now to having offset ones and all kinds of stuff. So good stuff there, and of course, the analog stick has become an industry standard, as they're saying. At the same time, I also believe that we should quickly graduate from the current controller, and we are attempting all kinds of things. Our objective is to achieve an interface that surpasses the current controller, where what the player does is directly reflected on the screen, and the user can clearly feel the result. This has not been achieved yet. We have tried all kinds of motion controllers, but none seem to work for all people. As the company that knows the most about controllers, we have been striving to create a controller that can be used with ease, and that will become the standard for the next generation. So there you have it. We are talking next generation stuff here. So I guess the next Switch, whatever you want to call it. I guess a lot of people would just call it the Switch 2 for now. But we're talking about the next generation system. Obviously, at this point, with the current Switch that we know, we're locked into Joy-Con controllers or a Pro controller, because that's just what developers expect to have access to at this time. They could, I think, introduce a controller similar to what Microsoft has done, their adaptive controller. So I would like to see Nintendo and Sony do that, but this actually sounds like they are thinking more outside the box and thinking about, I guess, revolutionizing the controller once again. And it's interesting to think about that, and I did post on Twitter, so let's see what a lot of you guys had to say. The Pork Chopper says, grip triggers on the back, maybe the controller could split in half like the Joy-Cons. I remember Sony did something kind of like that when they first showed off the PS4 controller. I remember at one point, or a PS3 controller, at one point they had it so that it split in half and you were climbing a ladder with it. I'm trying to remember if that was the PS3 or the PS4 controller. I remember they showed that off and I said, that's a little too out there. I don't know if Nintendo would get to that point, but I do think a split controller like the original Wii Remote could work. That one was, we'll talk about that in a second because it's another posting, that was actually fairly approachable, and it actually really worked well with the games that they ended up putting out. Gukagi Gong says, maybe a headphone jack? Oh, right. Yeah, so they can't put a headphone jack in yet, not next generation. I need them to wait about 15 years for, another few generations. So that way I could tell my kids, instead of my parents telling me that they had to get up and change the channel, I can tell them that I had to run, back in my day, we had to run a 20-foot cable from the original Switch so that I could listen to it through headphones while playing docked. That was our struggle back then. Although, look, I know you could just use a wireless headphone technically through USB, but that doesn't really help the joke at all. And then right below that, Aaron says, here's a great idea, add a screen to a normal controller. So I guess you're saying not the Wii U gamepad, but just a regular controller with a screen on it. We actually saw that PlayStation 5 controller that was leaked that had a screen on it, and I do question what a screen would actually accomplish to that degree, because we've seen things like the touchpad, for example, in the PS4 controller go heavily underutilized, so I don't know how a screen would work to make that any better. I just see that destroying the battery life even further, as opposed to something like we've seen the Nintendo Switch Pro controller have great battery life, and apparently even the new Xbox Elite controller is going to have similar battery life. So I prefer to have my controllers last longer, unless they could really find something for that screen to do that was really revolutionary. I do like the post for the Nintendo 64 controller from Butter Shutter. Here's the thing, when we first saw that controller, we didn't know what to make of it. We really didn't. It was just, I guess now even looking at it, it still looks weird. But it still had the same setup, D-pad on the left, face buttons on the right, start button in the middle, essentially. No select button, which is still weird now to look back on that, but the Z button on the back, I guess. It was an odd controller, and it had 3 handles. Again, very strange, and depending on the game you'd play, you would either use the D-pad or the analog stick. Wrestling games use the D-pad exclusively, and then you would move the analog stick to your special move, whereas obviously Mario 64, we would just use the analog stick exclusively. Now we have new 64 controllers that have kind of fixed it up a bit and make it more current, but that one still, it just looks so weird still, because Nintendo's going to have something come out of their R&D department that is going to look probably pretty strange if they are looking to revolutionize this thing. I don't know if it'll ever look that weird again, though. This is a good example here from Jim, is it put a crank on it. He's referring to the Play Date. That was something that kind of came out of left field as well. It's a new handheld that literally has a crank on the side. I actually covered it a bit in a Newswave video, and if you really think about that, that is fairly innovative. That's something I wouldn't have thought of, like, ever, right? But here we are now with a system. It doesn't even have a backlit screen, I believe. It's just a black and white screen with a crank on the side, and people are very interested, I think, just because of how different it is. That's, I think, kind of what Nintendo is thinking about right now, is to be innovative, but also usable. I don't know how usable that crank is going to be going forward. I think it's going to possibly limit some games, although it does have at least the face buttons and a D-pad on the front. Like we said before, something that has become an industry standard. So this was an interesting post as well. This one's from Christopher OS, saying, last time Nintendo got creative, they made this abomination, pointing to the Wii Remote. The thing about the Wii Remote is it actually worked. If you really consider what the Wii Remote is, when we first saw it, we were as confused as you would imagine. If you remember back then, which I guess is not terribly long ago, right? It was, what, 2005, 2006, when we found out about this being their controller. It was weird at the time, but when we actually got a hold of it, it actually worked. And then, of course, it can be turned sideways, and it turns into an NES controller, essentially. But the thing that a lot of people might not realize with this controller that I've thought about more since picking up, and I'm not even kidding, an Atari Lynx, is that this actually worked well for left-handed and right-handed gamers, because you might want to use that remote in your left or right hand, and because the nunchuck could be changed as well, rather than taking a controller that is set up specifically in one way, this actually would adapt fairly well to people who have a left hand as their dominant hand or the right hand, as you could just literally change sides. It was something I didn't think about until fairly recently with the Wii Remote, but yeah, that would work. The Wii Remote was just a very good controller for the masses. It was very approachable. It did use motion controls, as we talked about, a lot, but they did also mention motion controls in their annual investors gathering, specifically about that, and they said that not everything has been working, and something will come out of that R&D department, but there's gonna be a lot of stuff we don't see, and I do wonder if something that we may not see is something similar to what the Wii Remote and the Nunchuck was, just like the next gen. I know the Joy-Con, it kind of, is the next gen Wii Remote, I guess. But even beyond that, again, something tethered off of it, maybe something wireless, like a nunchuck. Vern says Power Glove 2.0, where what the player does is directly reflected on the screen. The tech is now there to integrate motion controls, haptic feedback, etc. There could be an accompanying Joy-Con style controller to serve as a sword, gun, or traditional controller. Are we about to get to the point now where the Power Glove makes a comeback to where you literally buy a glove that you put on, and then at that point, everything is there and you don't actually hold a controller, you put the controller on? That would probably be a bit out there, right? I think, but you never know. That could get to the point where you literally wear the controller while you're playing, although I think that would be much more suited to something like VR as opposed to couch gaming. I think we still want to hold a controller when we're just playing in front of the TV, but I absolutely think that could be something going forward that could be worked on for VR and would actually be very immersive if you don't actually have to hold a controller. That's something a lot of people realize, is when they're holding a controller, it takes them a bit out of the experience, but if you put the controller on, you might not, you might feel a bit more immersed in that world when you're playing, since all you're doing is moving your fingers or your hand or rotating. So interesting thought there. And of course, somebody had to reply with the rollin' rocker. That's Jimmy Murphy. Yeah, we got to get our feet into the action here, moving stuff around with that. That was such a weird idea. That's what the 80s and the 90s were full of, though. Weird ideas like that. Seriously, we had some strange ones, but maybe Nintendo is looking at very, very basic concepts and trying to improve on them. I don't think that's a thing that, although Sony's doing something like that technically for VR, so I guess you never know, but Nintendo just got into the VR space, and it's very basic VR. I don't think they want to jump heavily into something like, oh, you have to use your feet now and move around with that while using the controller. That seems a bit out there, but I mean, it's Nintendo, so you never know. So I want to talk a bit about what I think they could do, and actually I pulled up the Steam controller here, because I think that's something they could actually improve on. Now, the Steam controller was an interesting controller. It still is. You can still buy it technically. I think even GameStop stocks it somewhat. But the Steam controller attempted to eliminate some of the face buttons and analog stick, for example. They still had like A, B, X, Y, but the idea was to make it so that you had essentially haptic feedback touchpads. And it is something that's interesting to think about, where it will have general feedback to you. And we've seen Nintendo do things with HD Rumble, for example. And I do wonder if they've looked at some of the, I guess, the touchpad coverings with haptic feedback and thought a bit more about that. I mean, again, they've done stuff with HD Rumble, and that could be something they could be thinking about, where you have a controller that has some buttons, but also uses something like a touchpad here to better navigate games or anything like that. The thing about the Steam controller is most people like the idea of it and actually had a decent experience with it, but they also kind of look at this as being, this will be good, like 2 generations from now. But I feel like Nintendo could be looking at this similar to how they looked at the older Ataris and stuff that did use an analog stick, but just not well. It's just something I thought about, and it's just, again, we're trying to guess at Nintendo here, so like anything's on the table. And to be honest, we're probably not even thinking about what they're actually working on in their R&D department, but it's just the thought that came up. The Steam controller, just better and more creative. I'm curious what you guys think about this, though. What could they do with controllers to bring them into the next generation and innovate once again? They compare it to like when they did the D-pad. How can they do that again? I don't know. Let me know what you guys think down below. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys next time.